The world did not fall into World War II overnight. It slipped, step by step, through fear, anger, broken promises, and wounded pride. When the guns finally spoke in 1939, they echoed the mistakes of the past and the ambitions of powerful men who believed war could reshape the world in their image. The shadow of the First World War. World War I officially ended in 1918, but peace never truly arrived. Europe lay in ruins. Millions were dead, economies were shattered, and entire generations were scarred by trench warfare and loss. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was meant to secure lasting peace, but instead it planted the seeds of another catastrophe. Germany was blamed almost entirely for the war. It was forced to give up territory, reduce its army, and pay enormous war reparations. To many Germans, this treaty was not peace, it was humiliation. Inflation destroyed savings, unemployment soared, and anger grew. People searched for someone to blame and someone to follow. Across Europe and beyond, democracy struggled. Economic hardship made strong, authoritarian voices more attractive than slow political debate. In this atmosphere of despair and uncertainty, extremist ideologies began to rise. The rise of Adolf Hitler. In Germany, one man learned how to turn national pain into personal power. Adolf Hitler, a former soldier, joined a small political group that would later become the Nazi Party. He spoke of German pride, unity, and revenge. He blamed Germany's problems on the Treaty of Versailles, communists, and especially Jews. During the 1920s, Hitler's influence was limited, but the Great Depression of 1929 changed everything. Banks collapsed, factories closed, and millions lost their jobs. Desperate people listened more closely to Hitler's promises of strength, order, and national rebirth. In 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within months, he dismantled democratic institutions and turned Germany into a totalitarian state. Political opponents were silenced, freedom of speech disappeared, and the Nazi ideology became law. Germany was no longer just recovering, it was preparing. Germany rearms and the world watches. Despite clear restrictions under the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler began rebuilding Germany's military. He introduced conscription, expanded the army, and developed a powerful air force called the Luftwaffe. Tanks, weapons, and warplanes rolled out of factories at an alarming rate. The world noticed, but did little. Britain and France, still traumatized by World War I, desperately wanted to avoid another conflict. Their leaders believed that if Germany's demands were met, peace could be preserved. This approach became known as appeasement. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a region that was supposed to remain demilitarized. France and Britain protested but took no action. Hitler learned a dangerous lesson. The world would not stop him. The expansion begins. Hitler's ambitions went beyond Germany's borders. He dreamed of a vast empire, where Germans would rule over others. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria in an event known as the Anschluss. German troops entered Austria without firing a single shot, welcomed by cheering crowds. Next came Czechoslovakia. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, claiming Germans there were being mistreated. In September 1938, leaders of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy met in Munich. Czechoslovakia was not invited. The result was the Munich Agreement, which allowed Germany to take the Sudetenland. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home declaring peace for our time. But peace was an illusion. Within months, Hitler occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving his promises meant nothing. Italy and Japan, the other powers. Germany was not alone in its ambitions. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already established a fascist dictatorship. He dreamed of restoring the glory of the Roman Empire. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, using brutal tactics that shocked the world. Again, international response was weak. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan was expanding aggressively. Facing limited natural resources, Japan sought to build an empire across East Asia. In 1931, it invaded Manchuria. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale war against China, marked by extreme violence, including the infamous Nanjing Massacre. Germany, Italy, and Japan found common ground in their opposition to democracy and communism. They would later form the Axis powers, a coalition that would challenge the existing world order. The failure of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was created after World War I to prevent future wars. In theory, it was meant to resolve conflicts through diplomacy. In reality, it had no army and no real power to enforce decisions. When Japan invaded Manchuria, the League protested, but Japan ignored it and left the organization. When Italy attacked Ethiopia, sanctions were imposed, but they were weak and ineffective. These failures sent a clear message. International law could be broken without serious consequences. The path to war was widening, and no one seemed able or willing to stop it. A dangerous pact. By 1939, Europe stood on the brink. The final shock came in August when Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. The two ideological enemies agreed not to fight each other and secretly planned to divide Eastern Europe between them. This agreement stunned the world. It removed Hitler's biggest fear, a war on two fronts. Now, nothing stood in his way. The calm before the storm. On September 1, 1939, German forces prepared to move east. Tanks, soldiers, and aircraft stood ready. Across Europe, people sensed that peace was about to end. Diplomacy had failed. Promises had been broken. Fear hung heavy in the air. The world was about to be plunged into the deadliest conflict in human history. World War II was about to begin. The early morning of September 1, 1939, shattered Europe's fragile peace. Without a formal declaration of war, German forces stormed across the Polish border. Tanks thundered forward, aircraft screamed overhead, and artillery fire lit up the sky. This was not the slow, grinding warfare of the past. It was something terrifyingly new. Germany called it Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. The invasion of Poland. Poland was attacked from the west by Germany, using speed, coordination, and overwhelming force. German planes bombed airfields, railways, and cities, paralyzing Polish defenses. Tanks and mechanized infantry advanced rapidly, cutting off units before they could organize resistance. Poland fought bravely, but it was unprepared for this new style of warfare. Its army relied heavily on infantry and cavalry, facing an enemy that combined air power, armor, and radio communication with deadly efficiency. Then, on September 17th, another blow fell. The Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, following the secret agreement made with Nazi Germany. Trapped between two powerful enemies, Poland had no chance. By early October, the country was defeated and divided. Poland's fall shocked the world, but the worst was yet to come. Britain and France declare war. 2 days after the invasion, on September 3, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had officially begun. Yet, for months, very little happened on the Western Front. This strange period became known as the Phony War. Soldiers waited in trenches, civilians prepared for air raids, and governments planned for a conflict that everyone knew was inevitable. Behind the scenes, Germany prepared its next move. The fall of Scandinavia. In April 1940, Hitler turned north. Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, aiming to secure vital iron or supplies from Sweden and gain strategic naval bases. Denmark fell in a single day. Norway resisted longer, aided by British and French forces. But Germany's superior coordination and air power eventually forced the Allies to withdraw. By June 1940, Norway was under German control. These victories boosted German confidence and revealed weaknesses in Allied planning. The storm breaks in Western Europe. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched a massive offensive in Western Europe. The target was not just France, but also Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Allied commanders expected Germany to repeat the trench warfare of World War I. Instead, German forces bypassed heavily fortified defenses by pushing through the Ardennes forest, a route the Allies believed was impassable to tanks. They were wrong. German armored divisions surged forward, crossing rivers and breaking through lines with terrifying speed. Communication collapsed among Allied forces. Entire units were surrounded before they realized what was happening. The miracle of Dunkirk. As German forces advanced, hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers were trapped along the French coast near Dunkirk. The situation looked hopeless. Capture or destruction seemed inevitable. But in one of the most remarkable episodes of the war, a daring evacuation was launched. Between May 26 and June 4, 1940, naval vessels and hundreds of civilian boats, fishing boats, yachts, ferries, crossed the English Channel under constant air attack. Together, they rescued more than 330,000 soldiers. Though it was a retreat, Dunkirk became a symbol of courage and survival. Britain had lost its equipment, but it saved its army. The fall of France. France's defeat followed swiftly. German troops marched into Paris on June 14, 1940. The French government collapsed, and within days, France surrendered. The country was divided. Northern France came under direct German occupation, while the south was governed by the Vichy regime, a puppet government that collaborated with the Nazis. The fall of France stunned the world. In just 6 weeks, one of Europe's strongest military powers had been crushed. Now Britain stood alone. Britain refuses to surrender. With continental Europe under Nazi control, Hitler expected Britain to seek peace. Instead, Britain chose defiance. A new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, rallied the nation with powerful speeches. He promised struggle, sacrifice, and resistance. Britain would fight on land, at sea, and in the air. But Germany was not finished. The Battle of Britain begins. To invade Britain, Germany first needed control of the skies. In the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe launched a massive air campaign against the Royal Air Force, RAF. Day after day, German bombers and fighters attacked airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. British pilots, many of them young and outnumbered, rose to meet them in desperate aerial battles. Radar technology gave Britain a critical advantage, allowing fighters to be directed where they were needed most. Despite heavy losses, the RAF held on. As months passed, Germany shifted its focus from military targets to cities. The Blitz. Beginning in September 1940, German bombers launched nightly attacks on London and other British cities. Homes burned, streets collapsed, and civilians huddled in shelters as bombs fell from the sky. This campaign became known as the Blitz. Instead of breaking British morale, the bombings strengthened it. People helped one another, rebuilt amid ruins, and refused to surrender. Churchill's words echoed across the nation. Britain would never give up. By October 1940, Germany failed to defeat Britain in the air. Hitler postponed his invasion plans indefinitely. A turning point in the air. The Battle of Britain marked the first major defeat of Nazi Germany. For the first time, Hitler's advance had been stopped. Yet the war was far from over. Germany now looked eastward, toward the vast lands of the Soviet Union. In the Pacific, Japan continued its expansion. New fronts were forming, and the conflict was growing into a truly global war. The world had entered a dark and dangerous phase, and the storm was only beginning. By 1941, World War II was no longer a European conflict. It was becoming a global inferno, stretching from the frozen plains of Russia to the tropical islands of the Pacific. The decisions made this year would change the course of history forever. Hitler turns east, Operation Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. More than 3 million German soldiers, supported by tanks, artillery, and aircraft, poured across the borders of the Soviet Union. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse within months. He underestimated both the size of the land and the resilience of its people. German forces advanced rapidly at first. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Cities fell one after another. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured, many of whom would later die in brutal prison camps. But this was not just a military invasion. It was a war of annihilation. Nazi ideology viewed Slavs and Jews as inferior. Behind the front lines, special units known as Einsatzgruppen carried out mass executions, murdering entire communities. The invasion unleashed unimaginable brutality. The Soviet resistance. Despite staggering losses, the Soviet Union did not collapse. Factories were dismantled and moved east, beyond the reach of German bombers. Civilians, including women and teenagers, worked endless hours producing weapons and supplies. As German forces pushed deeper, they faced growing resistance. Soviet troops fought with desperation, knowing surrender often meant death. Partisan fighters sabotaged railways, destroyed supply lines, and spread fear behind enemy lines. Then came the Russian winter. Winter strikes back. German soldiers were unprepared for the freezing conditions. Temperatures plunged far below zero. Weapons jammed, fuel froze, and soldiers lacked winter clothing. Frostbite and exhaustion claimed thousands of lives. In December 1941, the Red Army launched a counteroffensive near Moscow, forcing German troops to retreat for the first time. Hitler's promise of a quick victory in the East was shattered. The war had entered a new, deadly phase. The war at sea intensifies. While battles raged on land, the oceans became deadly battlegrounds. German U-boats hunted Allied ships in the Atlantic, sinking vital supply convoys. Britain's survival depended on these shipments of food, fuel, and weapons. The battle beneath the waves was relentless. New technologies like sonar and depth charges gradually helped the Allies push back, but for a time, the Atlantic was a graveyard for ships and sailors. Japan moved south. In Asia, Japan faced growing pressure. The United States and other Western powers had imposed economic sanctions, cutting off vital oil supplies. Japan's leaders believed war was inevitable. Their solution was bold and risky: strike first. Japan planned to cripple American naval power in the Pacific, giving it freedom to seize territory across Southeast Asia. The target was the U.S. Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. December 7, 1941, a day of infamy. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor. Without warning, bombs and torpedoes rained down on battleships and airfields. Within hours, much of the American fleet was damaged or destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. The next day, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling it a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. World War II had truly become a global conflict. Early Japanese victories. With American forces reeling, Japan launched rapid offensives across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines fell in quick succession. Singapore's surrender in February 1942 shocked the British Empire. It was the largest defeat in British military history. Japanese forces established a vast empire, stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands. But their success planted the seeds of future defeat. They had awakened a powerful enemy: the human cost of war. As the war expanded, civilians suffered terribly. Cities were bombed, families were torn apart, and millions were displaced. Occupied territories endured harsh rule, forced labor, and terror. The Holocaust intensified as Nazi Germany implemented the final solution, systematically murdering millions of Jews and other persecuted groups in ghettos and extermination camps. The world was witnessing horrors on a scale never seen before. A fragile hope. Despite the darkness, signs of resistance appeared. Britain stood firm. The Soviet Union had survived the initial onslaught. The United States began mobilizing its massive industrial power. Factories roared to life. Soldiers trained. Ships and aircraft rolled off assembly lines in numbers the Axis could not match. The tide had not yet turned, but it was beginning to shift. The world holds its breath. By the end of 1941, the Axis powers controlled vast territories. Yet they now faced enemies who would not surrender and who were growing stronger every day. The coming battles would be longer, bloodier, and decisive. The fate of the world now depended on who could endure the longest. By 1942, World War II had reached its most critical stage. The Axis powers still controlled vast territories, but for the first time since the war began, their momentum began to slow. Across three major fronts, Eastern Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, the Allies prepared to strike back. This year would decide whether tyranny or resistance would shape the future of the world. Stalingrad, a city that would not fall. In the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler set his sights on the city of Stalingrad, a vital industrial center on the Volga River. Capturing it would cut Soviet supply lines and deliver a symbolic blow by taking a city bearing Stalin's name. The German advance was swift, but what followed was one of the bloodiest battles in human history. Street by street, building by building, soldiers fought at close range. Ruins became fortresses. Snipers hunted relentlessly. Civilians were trapped in the chaos, hiding in basements as bombs reduced the city to rubble. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War. Winter and encirclement. As autumn turned to winter, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive. They attacked the weaker Axis troops guarding the German flanks, and quickly encircled the German 6th Army inside Stalingrad. Hitler ordered his forces to hold their ground, promising supplies by air. The Luftwaffe failed to deliver enough food, ammunition, or medicine. Hunger and cold became deadlier than enemy fire. By February 1943, the remnants of the 6th Army surrendered. Over 300,000 Axis soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Stalingrad was a catastrophe for Germany and a turning point for the war. North Africa, the Desert War. While battles raged in the east, another critical struggle unfolded in North Africa. Control of the region meant access to vital oil supplies and the Suez Canal. German General Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, led Axis forces against the British. For months, victories swung back and forth across the desert. In October 1942, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery launched a decisive attack at the Second Battle of El Alamein. With superior numbers and supplies, the Allies broke through Axis defenses. Churchill later said, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." Axis forces were pushed westward, eventually trapped between British troops advancing from the east and American forces landing in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch. By May 1943, the Axis had been defeated in North Africa. The Pacific turning point, Midway. In the Pacific, Japan still seemed unstoppable. Until June 1942, Japanese leaders planned to lure the U.S. Navy into a trap near Midway Island. What they did not know was that American codebreakers had deciphered Japanese communications. Forewarned, U.S. forces prepared an ambush. During the Battle of Midway, American aircraft sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, while losing only one of their own. Thousands of experienced Japanese pilots were killed, losses Japan could not replace. Midway shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. From this point forward, Japan would be on the defensive. Island hopping begins. After Midway, the Allies adopted a strategy known as island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese-held island, they targeted key locations, bypassing others and cutting off enemy supply lines. Brutal battles followed at places like Guadalcanal, where jungle, disease, and relentless fighting tested soldiers on both sides. Victory came slowly and at a high cost, but the direction of the war was changing. Total war and the home front. As battles intensified, nations mobilized everything they had. This was total war. Factories ran day and night. Women replaced men in industrial jobs. Rationing limited food and fuel. Children collected scrap metal. Entire economies were reshaped to support the war effort. Cities paid a heavy price. Strategic bombing campaigns targeted industrial centers, destroying homes and killing civilians. The line between battlefield and home front disappeared. Resistance and hope. In occupied Europe, resistance movements grew stronger. underground fighters sabotaged railways, gathered intelligence, and helped Allied pilots escape. In France, Yugoslavia, Poland, and elsewhere, ordinary people risked everything to oppose Nazi rule. Their courage reminded the world that oppression could never fully extinguish hope. The Axis on the defensive. By the end of 1943, the Axis powers were retreating on multiple fronts. Germany faced the full strength of the Red Army in the east. Allied forces prepared to invade Italy and Western Europe. Japan struggled to defend its vast empire. The question was no longer if the Axis would be defeated, but how long the war would last and how many lives it would cost. The final battles were approaching. The end was in sight, but it would not come easily. By 1944, World War II had entered its final brutal chapter. The Axis powers were weakening, but their defeat would demand one last, enormous sacrifice. Across Europe and the Pacific, the Allies prepared decisive blows that would determine the fate of millions and the future of the world. D-Day, the liberation of Europe, begins. On June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history began. Known as D-Day, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, France. Before dawn, thousands of ships crossed the English Channel. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. Warplanes filled the sky. When the landing craft doors opened, soldiers faced heavy machine gun fire, mines, and artillery. The fighting was especially fierce at Omaha Beach, where American troops suffered devastating losses. Yet, through courage and determination, the Allies broke through German defenses. By the end of the day, a foothold in Western Europe had been secured. D-Day marked the beginning of the liberation of Nazi-occupied Europe. The push toward Germany. After Normandy, Allied forces advanced through France. Paris was liberated in August 1944, welcomed by cheering crowds. The Germans retreated, but they were far from defeated. In December 1944, Hitler launched a final desperate counterattack in the Ardennes forest, creating a bulge in the Allied lines. This became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Despite initial surprise and harsh winter conditions, Allied forces held their ground. Germany's last major offensive in the West failed. From that moment, defeat was inevitable. The Eastern Front closes in. While the Allies advanced from the west, the Soviet Red Army surged forward from the east. Cities were liberated one by one as German forces collapsed under relentless pressure. By early 1945, Soviet troops reached the outskirts of Berlin. The capital of Nazi Germany was surrounded. The fall of Berlin. In April 1945, the Battle of Berlin began. Soviet artillery pounded the city. Street fighting erupted as soldiers clashed among ruins. Inside his underground bunker, Adolf Hitler faced reality. On April 30, 1945, he took his own life. Days later, German forces surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945. Victory in Europe was declared on VE Day, May 8. Nazi Germany was defeated. The war in the Pacific continues. While Europe celebrated, the war in the Pacific raged on. Japanese forces fought fiercely, refusing to surrender. The United States advanced island by island, facing brutal resistance at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These battles revealed what an invasion of Japan might cost, hundreds of thousands of lives. American leaders sought a way to end the war quickly. The atomic bomb. In August 1945, the United States used a weapon unlike any seen before. On August 6th, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, instantly killing tens of thousands. 3 days later, a second bomb struck Nagasaki. The destruction was overwhelming. Faced with total annihilation, Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The formal surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd. World War II was over. The cost of the war. The war left the world scarred beyond measure. More than 60 million people were dead, soldiers and civilians alike. Entire cities lay in ruins. Families were shattered. The Holocaust had claimed the lives of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others persecuted by the Nazi regime. The full horror of the concentration camps shocked the world. Humanity had witnessed the depths of its own cruelty. A new world is born. From the ashes of war, a new global order emerged. The United Nations was formed to prevent future conflicts. Europe began rebuilding. Former colonies sought independence. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, emerged, setting the stage for the Cold War. The world had changed forever. The lasting lesson: World War II was more than a military conflict. It was a warning about hatred, unchecked power, and silence in the face of injustice. It showed that peace must be defended, truth must be protected, and humanity must never forget the cost of war. The darkest chapter in human history had ended, but its lessons remain.